So, human rights is massive, isn't it? How do we even break it down to mere mortals like myself around, how do we even look at human rights from the basic levels? And then how does that fit in, I guess, with other laws like the Send Law? Um, it's a huge question, and I'm sure you can answer it.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because on one level, I think human rights are really simple. They're rights for humans. And we have an interesting thing in this country, I think, where we talk quite a lot about values. So we talk about things like dignity and fairness, equality and protection and safety, but we don't really use the language of our human rights. And there's been a kind of a disconnect there. So on one level, really simple, rights for all humans. But I appreciate that because we don't use that language every day, that they can feel kind of very big and sometimes even scary or unknown, or sometimes something that shuts the conversation down. Like, that's my human rights and that's going to stop the conversation. Whereas for me, it's like, great, that's the opener. Let's talk about it. Is it? What do they mean? Are they really at play here? What are the decisions? So I think at the kind of most basic level, human rights are essentially legal, universal protections for all people in a particular place in the UK. So in the UK, we have the Human Rights Act, and we have this set of 16 protections that apply to all people. Everyone who's here, doesn't matter their age, doesn't matter kind of where they're from, their sex, their disability, whatever it is, these are rights for all of us. And I think that's really important because that's their strength and their power, because we're then moved from a place of kind of asking for charity or pity or empathy into a space where this is about all of us. And I think that's really important. But also because it's about all of us, that comes with challenges, because something that I often find myself saying is that human rights are for you and everyone you like, and all the people you don't like as well. And that's okay, because you have the right to think whatever you want. We all have our freedom of belief and expression, but actually we don't all get to choose. And the point is, human rights law says it's for all of us. So it's just really about those ideas around kind of basic dignity and respect and fairness, but putting them into an actionable legal framework that isn't dependent on any one individual's moral compass, but actually is rights and duties that we can use really practically.
And you've put it really simply, and but with articulation, which is you, Sanchita. But so how because obviously lots of people will band around, well, that's my human right, okay, and it's fine, but it might not be,
Yes.
per se, in the true sense of the word.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I suppose when we're looking at policies across the board, no matter who you are, whatever company you're in, whether it's a school, whether it's, an organization, should you be thinking, well, hold on a minute, I want to make this policy, or I want to adjust this policy, or I want to rewrite this policy? You have to look at the human rights side of things before you do that, wouldn't you?
Before you jump in, absolutely. And I think it does actually flag an important point, which is that kind of human rights there's obviously long legal histories, and sometimes I have a picture behind me of kind of lots of amazing women throughout history, and there have been lots of different struggles for rights. But human rights as legal standards, they're about the individual and the state, and the state is kind of a very, I think, often, like, it's, again, not a word we use very often, but what it really means is anyone who has public power. So whether that is whoever happens to be sitting in number 10 Downing Street, or the Department for Health and Social Care, or who's at the local authority, or who's in the school. So really, it's kind of that idea that when somebody has public power that they are exercising, whether that's making an individual decision or setting a policy or a service or a strategy or criteria, they are all bound by this duty in the Human Rights Act, which is Section 6, which is about making sure that they're respecting, protecting, and fulfilling human rights across all of their actions. And I do think that's really important, because I don't think it's in the Human Rights Act, but it applies across the board. So if you picked up a bit of health legislation or you picked up a bit of education legislation, it wouldn't say that in it, because the expectation is that all of those with public power know that they also have this duty under the Human Rights Act, and that's the foundation for everything else. It kind of 20 years of doing this work, more than 20 years of doing this work, I think that we all know that that's not an assumption we can rely on. People very rarely do know that that's their human rights duty. I mean, I've had conversations and sessions with people who've been commissioning public services for more than 30 years, and that conversation was the first time anyone said to them, you do also have a duty under the Human Rights Act, which sits underneath all of these other specific duties, and you see the kind of light bulb moment go off. So I think that's the way it should work. It doesn't always work in that way, which is why actually work on the ground is so important. And it's something that when we kind of work with organisations that are supporting parents and carers, including led by organisations, it's one of the things that we really try and work with them on, which is that very often when you're doing Human Rights Act advocacy, when you're using the language of the law, that might be the first time that the person with the public power, whether it's a caseworker or a manager, kind of complaints going through the whole service structure, that might be the first time someone's actually raised the human rights duty with them. And it can feel really unfair that you're advocating for your child, for your family, you're already having to claim those rights. And then you're also having to do a bit of education along with that campaigning. But I think that is also about giving us a bit of space to recognise that as well. And it gives us the space for movement. And all of a sudden it becomes a new and different conversation, and that carries opportunity for change, I think.
And for those that are listening to this episode are probably now panicked a little bit about, oh my gosh, I never even thought about the human rights. I'm just trying to develop this policy. I've been asked to develop this policy within my organisation.
Yes.
This is something else to now think about. And it's daunting, isn't it? But like you said, the Human Rights Act is the foundation for anything that's built on. So you should be looking at that first.
Exactly.
And then looking at the policy and the change.
And then looking at the policy change, exactly. And it's really interesting. So I think as a human rights organisation, BIHR is quite unique in our model because we work both with people who have rights, which is everyone, and we kind of work through sort of community, grassroots, kind of voluntary sector advocacy organisations to support them to use Human Rights Act advocacy in their work as their kind of, another tool to underpin their asks. But we also do work with the public sector, with services, with providers as well, essentially those who have duties. And that's quite unusual, I think, in the human rights world, because normally you kind of tend to work with those who are advocating from the outside. But for our kind of change model, we think that actually those two things, they're the same side, they're all different sides of the same coin. And so I think one of the things we see, particularly in our work with, services and authorities and providers, whether that's local or national, is that kind of the Human Rights Act can often be an unlock. Often they'll know that there's something that's not quite right with this policy or with this decision or this criteria. It might feel kind of inherently unfair. And of course, we all know that there are people who are kind of not out to do the right thing, but they are in a minority. For the most part, most people go to work wanting to do the right thing. And kind of the Human Rights Act gives them something that they can then unlock and challenge. And so we see lots of change internally in, NHS organisations, in local authorities, in provider services. Once you've kind of worked with their teams to build up their knowledge and confidence, they can then go back and say, well, actually, we've got this policy and the policy always seems to come first. But the way the Human Rights Act, which is one of the other duties in it, Section 3 duty works, is that other laws and policies need to be compliant with human rights. So if we've got an issue with this policy, actually people's rights don't change because they are universal in law. The policy needs to change. And we have so many examples of staff who have then kind of really unlocked that and have gone and got, looked at, we had kind of one person who looked at a mental capacity policy, and then she was like, oh, wait a minute, this actually links to our safeguarding policy. So that needs to change also. and our safeguarding policy links to our domestic abuse policy. And all of a sudden you have this cascade. So we kind of often talk to people, particularly in the sort of the ones with legal duties to uphold our human rights. We often talk to them about human rights kind of act approaches being a toolkit for doing their job, but also a language or a lens through which to do what they're doing. So it's not that they now do human rights work, it's they do their work in a way that's human rights compliant. And sometimes that does mean big conversations, but often what we tend to see is it's very much the thing that unlocks the change that they know needs to happen anyway.
And this is the thing, isn't it? Is that people listening to this will be going, "Oh my gosh, like this is now a massive piece of work." But the Human Rights Act is protection, not just for the people that you're trying to write a policy about, but also you as an individual and your
Yes.
company. So that's
Yeah,
the thing, isn't it? It protects both things, both people, both, or like it protects
absolutely. Yeah.
everybody.
It's not an us and them. And I think that's really important,
Yeah.
because I think we're so much in so many kind of fields and areas and aspects of our lives, but I definitely see it in Send a lot, kind of both professionally and personally. We're very much in an us and them kind of zero sum game a lot of the time, and really understandably, because we're talking about super serious things that are hugely impacting people's lives. But one of the useful things around human rights is that they are for all of us. And so whether you're writing the policy or you're subject to the policy, and that kind of brings a whole nother level, I think, which it kind of reconnects us with the human, which is so often lost.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Is that even those who are writing these policies, they are human. I think, as parents, and I'm a parent, we get so embroiled in the battle that we are facing. And I'm using the term battle,
Yeah,
and some people would say that is an exaggeration. For those who are living, breathing, eating it, it
absolutely.
is not an exaggeration. But equally, those people who are writing these policies where you think that they're against you, actually, they are human as well. And we need to be mindful of that. And it's quite tricky, isn't it? Because the money, the time, the staff levels are all on everybody's struggling. And it's just that one more thing to sort of think about with the human rights. But that's the point. We are all human.
Yeah.
We all have rights, and it's how it all fits in. And I think this is a really important message, Sanchita, is that your human rights comes first, and then everything else again comes
Yeah.
after it. So I guess the next question would be, so how does this fit in with Send law? How do we
Mm,
make sure that Send policies, or anything to do with Send, whether it's in a school, behaviour policies, that
yeah.
always keeps coming up. I've mentioned behaviour policies, and it's been mentioned on my podcast already, but behaviour policies, uniform policies, how
Mm,
does that fit in? Because we're talking about children. So does the children still part of the Human Rights Act, and is it
yeah.
important?
It's a great question, because we get asked that all the time. So we'll kind of talk about, the Human Rights Act is the two criteria basically that you have to be able to be covered by the rights in the Human Rights Act is, are you human, and are you here because it's a UK law? So those are the only two criteria. So it doesn't change because you're a child, for example, or because you're disabled, or because you're a disabled child. And I do think that's important, because sometimes we're operating in very complex legal systems and structures where different rights will apply to different groups of people, or at different times, or contingent on different things. And the point of human rights is that they sit well above all of it. There is no, you don't lose your human rights. Some human rights can be restricted some of the time, and I think that's important to know because they are practical, and we can't all have an absolute right to all of those 16 rights, because how on earth would society operate? It just wouldn't. We'd be bumping into each other all the time. So they have kind of practical inbuilt mechanisms in them to the non-absolute rights to help us navigate some of those tricky situations. So we do have a right, but maybe this is one of the situations where we have to look at a restriction or a limitation, and how does that balance work? And that might be our right to respect for private and family life, for example, which is the one that I defy anyone in a SEND situation to come up with an example that does not fall within this right, because it covers so much of our everyday lives around our kind of relationships, our community, our well-being, our family, our correspondence, mobile phones, like all of these things kind of fall into that right. But where kind of an authority, somebody with a duty, a school or a local authority or an NHS organisation can show that restricting that right slightly is lawful, is for a legitimate aim, which is in the right itself, and that's usually to protect the person or the wider community, and it's proportionate, then a limitation or a restriction might be possible. But what we often see is that the assumption that we'll just restrict that right, and they don't kind of go through that test, that 3-stage test, and all of them need to be met. And so often it falls down at the lawful point because something has just become habit or practice or the way we do things. And then we stop and say, well, actually, what you're doing interferes with a human right. Can you show me the law which allows you to do this thing? And in terms of advocacy, as you know, parents or carers who are advocating, that 3-stage test is fundamental, because it's not on you to show that the restriction of the right is not correct. It's on the organisation restricting it to show how they meet that test. So it's a very powerful advocacy and accountability tool, because you're asking them, and I would always say ask them, get it in writing. What is the law that allows the restriction of this right? What is the legitimate aim? So the law is often whether we can restrict it. The aim is, why are we restricting it? It has to be to protect the person or the wider community. And then the proportionality element, which is often where things fall down, is the how. And very often we see the most restrictive thing happen because it's the easiest. And actually that's not in keeping with human rights. It has to be the least restrictive option available. So you have to explore all the different options. And that's then when actually you can come together and you can suggest, well, this restriction actually would be much better here because it's less restrictive. It meets kind of our child's rights much better, but we recognise that there is some give here. And you kind of get into a dialogue and a conversation, and it can be really practical. And I think kind of with the pressure that the system's under, it's often the quickest, easiest, most restrictive thing that happens, or just a simple no. Whereas that kind of tool of working through those 3 tests of lawful, legitimate, proportionate, so kind of whether, why, and how, that's really helpful because it opens up that conversation. But equally, there are also some rights which are absolute. So one of them is our right to be free from inhumane and degrading treatment. And that's about really serious harm, irrespective of the intent. And again, I think that's something that gets muddled. So something that we hear is, well, we didn't intend for that to happen, even though that's the impact on the person. That doesn't really matter in terms of human rights law. It's about the impact on the person. So whether it's a decision or a policy, if that's left someone in a particularly vulnerable and harmful state, then there's no resources, staffing, none of those are legal arguments for doing that. Something has to be done there to support that. And in that kind of situation, some of the legal factors that we take into consideration about the impact of that harm would be age, for example, and disability. So again, it gives us a kind of a strength or a power in our arguments to say, well, actually, we think this might be risking inhumane and degrading treatment. You might think it's okay for this person, but for this individual here, particularly because of their age, maybe they're kind of younger, maybe they're older, and because of their disability or their health status, the impact here is really significant. So you have to act, because if you don't act, it's a breach of an absolute right, and there's no lawful restriction of that.
And that's really interesting. And I loved how at the very beginning of that conversation there, you mentioned about mobile phones.
Yes.
And there's lots of things.
It comes up so
there's
often.
Lots of things in the press at the moment around
are.
schools and mobile phones. And I know some families will argue that the blanket policy of no phones in schools, if it does come in, and I try not to be political on this podcast, but there will be some families that will use, well, it's their human right. Is it their human right?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one.
I'll put you on the spot there, Sanchita.
No,
Sorry.
it's okay, because but even before it came into the press, kind of just recently, and kind of looking at that as a kind of policy, a possible policy change, something that kind of, it comes up a lot in our work, because we do a lot of work in mental health, but particularly in inpatient mental health. We do a lot of work in community as well, but in inpatient mental health and in CAMHS inpatient services. So without fail, I don't think we've ever done any work in CAMHS inpatient services where mobile phones haven't come up. So it's something we're very used to talking about. It's a little bit different in that situation, because you're in an inpatient situation where essentially the state, the kind of public service, the NHS usually, or could be a provider, has total control over your life. So actually it's very arbitrary to kind of come in and cut off your kind of potential access. So it's a little bit different to the question in schools. And I think the issue is that our right to respect for private and family life, it covers our well-being, it covers our relationships and our contact with others, and it also covers our correspondence. So there are arguments to be made that actually your mobile phone and having access to it is part of that right. And then you get into that lawful, legitimate, proportionate question about restricting it. And so that's where the kind of questions need to be asked. So is there a law? Well, potentially we're looking at, there might be some changes. Is it for a legitimate aim? Potentially the argument is that it's to protect the young people in terms of their kind of well-being, their learning. There are kind of potential other issues around protecting them from kind of, phone rate related bullying or whatever it might be, whilst they're in school. And then you've got the proportionality question. So is it the least restrictive thing you can do here? And that's where it's going to get, I think that's where the argument needs to be had. I think the biggest thing to remember with this kind of question, and kind of more broadly questions where we're having a blanket approach to something, is that very often, kind of, if we have a blanket approach, the human rights question there will be, what is the ability to consider the impact on an individual's human rights? So it's not that we can't have blanket approaches, and sometimes blanket approaches are put in because they are to protect a particular group. So that makes sense, right? They're there because we've seen there's a rights issue, and this is how this service is going to run to protect this group of people. So in some situations that might be okay, but more often than not, you need to be able to show that you've been able to consider the impact on the individual and kind of what is your discretion and your leeway. And there could certainly be arguments made around, particularly for around kind of disability or health, for children who do need access to that. So you'd be combining your kind of Article 8 rights and then the potential of discrimination kind of based on, say, for example, a health status or health condition. And that's our Article 14 rights, our kind of non-discrimination rights. So you'd be sort of combining those together to talk that through. But yeah, it's working through that 3-stage test, and I suspect most of this will come down to proportionality.
And it's really important that you've touched on about health and, your health and well-being. There will be some children that just will not be able to access school because of anxieties if they don't have their mobile phone. And equally, if you're a type 1 diabetic, for instance, your monitor for your blood sugars goes through your mobile phone.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's that, and I'm glad that you touched on around mental health. inpatient beds as well, because I had that conversation this week actually with some people who are no longer, they're not in mental health units anymore, but the one thing that came up was that they were eventually able to have their mobile phone, and that helped them with their recovery because
Absolutely.
they were autistic, and it was important about family and relationships, and that it was part of their recovery to have that contact with the family. It was really important. So I'm glad that you mentioned that unprompted as well, which is great.
I know. It's interesting though. We see it a lot, and actually we've seen a lot of service-led work around that, where we've kind of started talking about human rights, and they've kind of, had that flag. And it brings us back to the point you made earlier about the kind of us and them question as well. Because if you imagined as kind of one of the staff in that service, if you went into hospital for care and treatment and the first thing you had to do was give up your mobile phone, you would say no. And it's the same rights that apply to the young people and to the staff there. And we've kind of seen some great kind of approaches from staff in those situations who've totally flipped the policies and the approaches in their services, and absolutely say it has massively impacted the relationship between young people and staff, and therefore also young people's recovery.
And I think it's also really important, like you say, not to do a blanket brush approach to, having no mobile phones. I don't know why we're still having this conversation around mobile phones, but it's really, really important, isn't it? And there is some like conversation or some education around this. In a previous episode, I think it was about reasonable adjustments, and we were talking about a child having a high energy snack when the school had their healthy school status, and so you weren't allowed crisps, or you had to have fruit. And then there's this one child who's got a bag of crisps, and it's like, well, why has that child got a bag of crisps? And they needed it as part of their I think they were again a diabetic. And this is the point, isn't it? Is that it's about having a conversation. It's about getting to know what people need. It's about individuals. It's about looking at everybody's needs and wants, and how we best develop something that's going to be great for everybody.
Yeah.
And this is where the human rights thing sort of comes in. And I know of conversations where people have used it as almost like a weapon. Well, it's my human rights. I need to go to the toilet. It's my human right. How it's a really difficult approach sometimes, isn't it, to just hold your tongue and think about it before you answer. So how do we put that in real terms in the real life?
Yeah, and well, I think it's a kind of, you sort of started that bit off with saying, there's a kind of education piece around it. And there is, because I think that's why our model is very much working with both sides of the coin. So sometimes we will be asked by a service to produce information for their service users, kind of whoever's kind of coming in to access the service or trying to access the service about human rights. And we'll say, well, that's great, but if your staff don't know anything about it, then what are they going to do when they are confronted with that conversation? So it's very much has to be kind of both sides of that coin. So it is about supporting people to understand what their rights are, and also to be like really honest and to have an honest conversation about that. So like something we say so frequently is human rights are not a magic wand that is going to kind of make everything better for you instantly. And very often the things that we might want are not actually are things that are covered by our legal rights. And that's okay, like that's fine. We make the arguments in different ways, but we also have to be really careful of not trying to make everything kind of fall into that bracket of human rights, because they are a really powerful legal tool. And that thing of, when something becomes everything, it's nothing. So I think there's that kind of note of caution, but there is also a kind of broader note, which is that I just don't think we use human rights in our advocacy very well. So it's actually about that kind of support and education piece, and actually to work out, when we're looking at this situation, is it about human rights? Can I kind of use the duties that are on the services in this situation to uphold human rights, to actually have a different conversation and look at the outcome that we want to get, which is much more rights respecting. So I think we actually just don't do enough of that at all. And I think sometimes there might be kind of a flippant, this is about my human rights, when it isn't. And we do have to be mindful of that. But I think it's the bigger piece of actually just using it as our language kind of for advocacy where we should be using it. I think that's the bit that is just it's so missing. And we talk about light bulb moments quite a lot at BIHR. And I think kind of when often we kind of like I said, kind of for public staff and public services, it's often a bit of an unlock. And I think in advocacy for, in a SEND situation for parents, carers, advocates, it's often also a bit of a light bulb moment of like bringing all these things together into sort of one kind of framework. And sometimes it can be really difficult to think about, well, is it kind of this policy, or is it this law, or is it this regulation, and how does that fit together? Whereas if you can kind of say, well, actually, no, this uniform policy, for example, is significantly impacting my child's well-being, and this is why it's doing that, and it's related to, say, a disability or health condition, so I also think it's discriminatory as well. That kind of just opens another conversation, which is not about the specifics of which bit of a regulation or a policy we're kind of getting into. So I think it can simplify things as well and kind of get to the nub of the conversation quicker, which is important. But I think the bit I worry that we don't do enough of is the bit around the support and to kind of increase that advocacy to use the Human Rights Act in that way.
No, I agree, and I think it's really important, and you touched on it in that, is that the people who are upholding these policies are doing so because that is the policy of the place that they work,
Exactly.
or they
Yeah.
volunteer in, or
Yeah.
whatever. And so we do need to be mindful of that. And this episode is literally about giving you the tools to start a conversation. This
Yes.
is not around beating people around the head. It's
Yeah.
it's a conversation starter, isn't it?
100%. I think it's really interesting because I think people often think human rights is really combative, and I think it can be when it needs to be, and you're dealing with a really urgent, really serious issue. Absolutely, like kind of we do find ourselves in that kind of much more battle combative frame of mind because something's very, very urgent, which isn't to say that we're not living in a state of urgency around lots of things. But I think one of the really interesting things about the work at BIHR is that people tell us like it's not about having a fight with somebody on both sides of the coin. And I think that's again one of the things that is a bit of a moment where we're so locked into battle mode that what's quite different with using Human Rights Act advocacy is rather than saying this is unfair, like, look, essentially, I think this is a terrible policy, or you're a terrible person for doing this. And for the person on the other side to be like, I think you're a terrible, annoying parent, or whatever it is. And we hear it all, right? And kind of that won't be anything that people listening don't hear kind of from whichever side of the coin they're on. But a Human Rights Act advocacy conversation is about going, look, I understand that this is the policy or this is the decision, but this is the law that sits above that. And the impact of that is actually risking this right here. And I don't know that you've met the tests for that. So these are the tests. Can you tell me how you've met them? And then the person kind of making the decision or implementing it has to stop and think and go, oh, okay, have we done that? And goes back and kind of then has to kind of do that piece of accountability around that decision making. And very often, as I said kind of earlier, might be the first time they've heard that, but it will also give them the tools to go back and to change internally as well. So this idea that so much of life is directed by our own kind of moral compass, right? And I think there's something that's just so I mean, I hate the word empowering because I think it's overused loads, but there is like this empowering moment about taking it out of any individual and into the law. It's like we're not talking about whether you're a good person or a bad person. We're talking about the law, the rights and the duties.
And so then it takes that personal element out of
Yeah.
that and the personal blame, doesn't it? Because
Yes.
I and I do think that anybody who's writing policies, it's a difficult job. I mean, I've
Mm,
written policies over the years. I know you have,
yeah.
and trying to think of things, all things to all people whilst
Yeah.
you're writing them is
Yeah.
quite tricky to do. But it is absolutely fundamental that we look at, because I've never thought about, oh, I'm writing this policy, I need to look at human rights first.
Yeah.
Actually we should, and that's the importance of this podcast, isn't it? And it is around it protecting everybody around the table. That's what human rights
Yeah.
are for. It's
Yes.
not just a them and us, it's everybody around that
Yeah.
table, and to make sure that the everything is followed, but first and foremost that the policies have to adhere to the Human Rights Act.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And I think in obviously we're talking about send here, but I think this goes for any sort of issue, area, sector you're working on. You are there because you're focused on education policy or whatever it might be. And so you have kind of a very specific silo that you work in. And of course, like that's your area, and you will know the law, and you will know kind of who it is that you're talking to about developing that policy, whatever it might be, the decision. But what human rights forces us to do is take a step back and say, well, what's the impact of this? So actually it might have an impact in send, for example. Lots of what I see is this is the decision, and it's about this child. Okay, but the impact of that decision is, what about also the rights of the parent in that situation, the siblings in that situation? And actually, have you considered any of this in terms of your decision making? And I think what it forces kind of us to do, like when we're exercising that public power, is to recognize that we're all people, which is important, but that actually your decision might be about this one person here, but that person doesn't exist in isolation, and actually there's lots around it here. So we've had examples. So kind of I'm just thinking from a sort of mental health context from a fairly recent bit of work where we do kind of leadership programs around human rights within public services, and one of the leads had spoken to us quite recently about being at a very big multidisciplinary team meeting about moving a woman to a different hospital bed, uh, and loads of discussions were happening. And she said, after 15 minutes, I just stopped everyone and I said, this woman has two young children, including one who is under the age of 2. The impact of this decision on their human rights as well as hers is so significant. Fundamentally changed the conversation. And I think that's really powerful to remember as well. We easily lose sight of all of the people involved in a decision when we're focused on the regulation, the policy, the decision, the criteria. And the Human Rights Act forces us to take a step back.
But it's anybody listen to this are going to go, we've not done that. Oh my
Mm,
gosh, we've not done that. And that's and that is a problem. But equally, it's like how do you move forward? And is it a
yes.
case of you just right, you acknowledge it now and then you move forward with that. So you
Yeah.
change how you're doing things going forward.
Yes, I think so we one of the community organisations that we worked with on our sort of last iteration of our community programme was a parent and care organisation, Parent and Care Alliance in Gloucestershire. And one of the we sort of co-produced a advocacy toolkit together, which is much more for kind of parent and carer. So it's not quite answering your question, but I will get there, I promise. But the reason I kind of brought that up is because one of the big bits of discussion we had there was around it can we're actually I'm here kind of saying we've got this great tool, the Human Rights Act, and actually you've probably never thought about it, but you can use it and it could really help here. Might not win everything, but actually it could really help, and it's really underused, and it's an opportunity to gain a bit of power back. But it's also the flip side of that is that we're also saying that some of these terrible things that happen to you are actually human rights risks or breaches. And that's quite a confronting thing to kind of, say to somebody, that actually what you're experiencing is a risk or a breach to your human rights, and it's a big thing to deal with. And we sort of talked about how a rights-based approach is about recognizing that level of trauma and actually kind of making sure that we're mindful of that in what we put forward and the kind of support suggestions we put in. But the reason I kind of flagged that is because I think sometimes that's easier to see than also the impact on the people who are making the decisions and the confrontation for them. And I think people who are working in those public systems, in providers in the NHS, in local authorities, they are often working in what is a very fractured, often broken, often under-resourced system. And it's also quite confronting to say to them, but you're the state. Like, that recognition of actually you hold this huge amount of power over other people's lives when you probably quite frequently feel quite powerless in your role. So a kind of also recognizing that element of it as well. But that's the opportunity, right? We haven't done this. Okay, so we recognize we haven't done it, as you said, and we look at what are we going to do next. And the one thing kind of I would hope that kind of people go away with, if they're kind of working in those services and those bodies, is to not kind of, don't take it as an overwhelm. So don't kind of say, oh, well, if this is like essentially every decision we're making, then we've got a lot of work to do. And that's true. You probably do have a lot of work to do, but start. The most important thing is to start and to do it with something. And you'll be surprised at how that grows and grows and grows. Some of our best stories of change have come not from the thing we started working with organisations on, but where it led them to. And the worst thing you can do is to know it and not do anything about it. There will always be something you can start with.
Yeah, thank you for that. And this is the thing, isn't it? Is that when you look at it on face value, and somebody reminds you that you're in breach of human rights, or you could be,
Yeah.
it's quite a lot, isn't it? To think, oh my gosh, how do I work through this? I mean, we're lucky to have organizations like you, where you can come in with no judgment and just go, right, okay, let's start with a blank slate. Let's move forward with this, because that's important, isn't it?
So important. It's really important. And that's not to say that you ignore what's gone before. You don't do that, but you need to make the start. And yeah, you need to kind of start with that open approach of, things may not have been right before, but what we're going to do is actually put the intention and the action to do something about them. And like I said, we work with public services. We kind of do all manner of different things that we're kind of brought in to help them with. Essentially, I guess we're a commission service in that respect. But our approach is rarely that we go in and we're like, right, this whole organisation, we're going to change you from top to bottom. This is just not realistic, right? So it's like, okay, what are often start with the tricky things. Because if you can get it right with the more tricky things, the less tricky things will follow.
And it's about dealing with situations in bite-sized pieces, isn't it? Is to break it down, don't deal with it in a huge chunk, and then move forward to make sure that you're compliant and that you're adhering to the law. And you touched on about public services, but what happens if you're in a private sector? Does it still apply?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So kind of when we started chatting, one of the things I said was that human rights are about the individual and the state. And sometimes that can be, it can be a bit frustrating, I think, for people, because you have the kind of, well, if I want my rights upheld, you know, I kind of want to uphold your rights. It's a mutual respect kind of scenario. And on a moral level, absolutely. But that is one of the things about the law. That's not how it works at a legal level. So, for example, like you and I don't owe each other human rights duties because we're just ordinary individual people, or in legal terms, private individuals. But when the Human Rights Act was going through Parliament, they're kind of the definition of what is a public body or a public organisation was left deliberately open, because even in the debates in Parliament in the 1990s, they were saying, you know, actually all services, public services are not provided entirely by public bodies. And look at where we are now. I mean, how much of our health and care services are provided by private institutions and organisations. So what they did was to put in a definition which says that you're either a kind of standard core public body, or if you're a private organisation but you're performing public functions, then those functions are covered by the Human Rights Act. And so that's really important, because it means, you know, where you've been contracted, commissioned, where you're stepping into the shoes of the state or the public body, that you're still covered. And really importantly, whoever commissioned and contracted you is also covered. The courts have been really clear that you can't contract out your obligations. So even if you have a private provider, but that provider has been contracted, you also can go back to the commissioner and contractor around human rights issues and kind of raise your concerns there. And we've definitely worked both with public sector bodies and advocacy organisations where they've gone back to commissioners on issues like that. So that's kind of a bit of like how it works. It is important to say, though, if your relationship is entirely private and there's no involvement of a kind of public organisation there, then human rights doesn't bite there. There's a but human rights doesn't bite there. So an example like that I use sometimes, my friend not too far from here runs a therapy farm for people with learning disabilities and also alternative education provision. And almost all of the people who she supports and kind of come into her service are there because it's been a commissioned or contracted service by local authorities. But where a private person has called up and kind of has arranged that relationship, that's entirely private and human rights wouldn't attach there. But as she would say, and as lots of the private providers that we work with would say, we've got human rights duties for this whole group of people here. So of course we should just apply the same to everyone who's in our service, because actually the way we treat people shouldn't be about how they ended up in our service. So you've got a kind of element there around really you should just be doing it anyway, because what sense does it make to say, well, we're going to respect your human rights but not yours over here? So you kind of have that aspect of it. But then you also, even if you have a situation where a provider might not be covered, and I think the sort of loopholes around that are ever being closed. So we just closed one with the new Mental Health Act. Something happened with a case which essentially said that private providers under Section 117 of the Mental Health Act, so aftercare, weren't covered. And that had huge implications for particularly including young people coming out of inpatient services, particularly autistic people and people with learning disabilities. But that's been closed now. They absolutely do have that duty. We got that change in the law, and that came in December. So where there are some of those loopholes there, we're kind of working to close them down. But if that provider is providing any kind of regulated service, the regulators are all public bodies as well. So we can go to those regulators and we can raise the issues with them too, because they have Human Rights Act duties. That's probably about the most technical kind of legal aspect, but I think it's important because it is really practical, because it's about who do you make your Human Rights Act advocacy argument to.
No, and I think that's really important, isn't it? And trust me to ask the difficult questions. Um, but we are now at the end of this episode. But
Okay.
I know it's
It's gone
gone really
really
quick.
quickly.
Sanchita, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. I appreciate the conversation. Maybe we'll have you back for another episode.
Yeah, definitely. I'd be really up for it. There's kind of, I think there's lots more to say about kind of how you can use the duties, but also the rights in the advocacy. And so kind of like where they attach to different kinds of issues and sort of some of the stories of success that we can share to hopefully show that this isn't pie in the sky. It's really practical stuff about actually how do we get kind of change on the ground, but also in systems. And I'm thinking about the white paper and actually making sure that the systems are also rights compliant
Yeah,
in the first place. So yeah, I think there's loads more to
we
say
can
for
talk
sure.
about.
We
Yeah, for
could,
sure.
yeah. But hopefully everyone will kind of go away with uh, a kind of reassurance that our kind of human rights are not nice to do's, they are legal protections for all of us in the law, in the Human Rights Act. And I think thinking about our audience and thinking about SEND particularly, I think one of the things I always kind of hope people take away is that this is not about kind of charity or special treatment, even. It's actually just about removing the barriers that allow us to enjoy our human rights equally. And that's surely got to be something that everyone wants.
Perfect ending. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.